Hello and welcome to this podcast. The focus of this podcast is how can psychology affect performance? This is the first in a series of 3 podcasts on this particular focus question. This podcast will focus on motivation, and in this podcast we'll look at positive and negative motivation as well as intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. As a result of watching this podcast, you should be able to evaluate performance scenarios to determine the appropriate forms of motivation. The syllabus provides an example, golf versus boxing. In the next podcast, we will look at anxiety and arousal, and in the last podcast, we will focus on the psychological strategies to enhance motivation and manage anxiety. Motivation. Motivation is a heightened state of arousal directed towards achieving a particular goal. Motivation can be defined as that which induces a person to behave in a particular way. Motivation may be either positive or negative. An appropriate level of motivation not only improves your physical performance, but it is also very important in learning physical skills. Motivation greatly influences the attention which an athlete gives to a task. What motivates one person to do something may not be important to another person at that particular time. The level of motivation we are able to achieve is affected by factors. Some of these factors include the athlete's self-esteem, that is, how the athlete feels about themselves, the expectation the athlete feels in terms of their personal goals and the goals of others, the standard of competition in which the athlete participates, the impact of environmental factors such as wind, rain and heat, whether the athlete feels that they have the support of spectators, and specifically their reactions to their friends, peers, and others who they have respect for, the state of the event the athlete participates in, for example, how close an individual or a team is to winning or to losing, and finally, the ability of a coach to motivate and encourage the athlete and the team as a whole. These factors can be classified in one or two ways. Factors can either be personal. Personal factors are subject to change, such as the competitive drive, self-confidence, and those intrinsic and extrinsic factors in athlete experiences. And there are some personal factors that are not subject to change. So, for example, the anxiety an athlete feels, the ability to cope with stress, and the perception of the outcome. That is, the external factors such as luck, versus internal factors such as skill, ability, and effort. The second factors that can be categorised according to situational factors. These situational factors can also be subject to change. So, for example, goal setting, rewards, and social reinforcement. There are other situational factors which are not subject to change. These include things like competition, the team environment, and the presence of others. Positive and negative motivation. Positive motivation occurs when an individual's performance is driven by previous reinforcing behaviours such as rewards, praise, or recognition. Athletes realise that continuing to perform as required will result in additional rewards, and the athlete is motivated to reproduce this performance to receive the rewards. To a certain extent, the athlete is conditioned to perform in expectation of reward. Positive motivation relies on self-reinforcement and reinforcement by the coach, family, peers, and the media. If this is not forthcoming, motivation is diminished. Coaches need to look for ways of reinforcing desired behaviours in players, and may include incentives, progress charts, or having others reinforce the player. Negative motivation is characterised by an improvement in performance out of fear of the consequences of not performing to expectations. Persistent negative motivation can erode an athlete's self-confidence and self-esteem. While some players may respond to negative reinforcement, some of the time, regular long-term negative reinforcement can undermine confidence, initiative, and belief in oneself. Positive reinforcement is more effective than negative reinforcement. By setting achievable challenges, coaches can motivate players to perform. Threats distract the athlete from the task. Positive motivation is also more sustainable than negative motivation. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation refers to motivation that comes from within the individual. It is a self-propelling force that encourages athletes to achieve because they have an interest in a task or activity and they enjoy learning and performing the movements. Athletes that are motivated to improve their performances by establishing competence in the task are said to be task-oriented. They find improving their distance, time, etc. a challenge in itself and enjoy meeting the demands of competition. Extrinsic or external motivation occurs when an individual's internal state is modified by sources originating from outside the person. Extrinsic motivation comes from rewards for a particular effort, such as financial remuneration, a trophy, or even praise from the coach, peers, or the media. Athletes are most responsive to this form of motivation, are keen to meet challenges, to demonstrate their abilities, and be appropriately rewarded. Earlier I spoke a little bit about reinforcement. Reinforcement can be social, material, or internal. Reinforcement is a form of reward or punishment or threat that influences the probability that an action or behaviour will occur. Reinforcement is an essential part of learning and can come from many sources. So, for example, a golfer who is experiencing difficulty putting from a set distance is told to work on their technique. When the player changes the technique and begins to consistently sink each of the putts, the success of the new technique reinforces the purpose for change. Reinforcement can be positive or negative and works best with individuals rather than teams. Social reinforcement comes from family, peers, and coaches, and arises from social contact in an atmosphere of interaction, teamwork, and cooperation. Social reinforcement causes changes in behaviour depending upon the influence of the source, and it can be positive or negative. For example, a young rugby league player can be motivated to change their behaviour, for example, their attitudes to training, drinking, and drug taking, because of the influence of an idol player within the team. Material reinforcement is a tangible reward for behaviours such as trophies and ribbons. Material reinforcement can also be negative. This may include things such as the numbers of errors made on a score sheet. Material reinforcement may be valuable in the development of all stages of skill learning, rather than to serious athletes where world titles or records are more important. Internal motivation is the athlete's own desire to compete well. It is often referred to as covert or disguised reinforcement. It can come from previous achievement, which in turn spurs the athlete on, or can come from watching someone else's success and learning from that experience. Now it's over to you. Your job is to evaluate performance scenarios to determine the appropriate forms of motivation. In this particular table, you can see there are different sports, and on the left-hand column, you can see that we've divided those into the positive and the negative and the intrinsic and the extrinsic. Using some of the examples in this video, as well as the examples that you have from your own experience and from classwork, your job now is to identify which of these particular factors applies in various sporting scenarios. The example that I used in this podcast was that of the golfer. The golfer experiences positive motivation or positive reinforcement when they begin to sink putts. And how do they do that? They do that because they practice with really, really good technique. So your job now is to go away and think about those sport-specific examples and complete the table. This table will also be discussed in class with your peers and with myself and with Mr. Zamet. Thank you for listening to this podcast.